On the morning of April 18, 1943, 16 American pilots flew 1,000 miles over open ocean to kill one man. The airplane they flew was the only one on Earth that could reach him. It was fast, it was strange, it had two tails and a shape no one had ever seen before. And it had been drawn by a man who grew up so poor he walked home through back alleys so the other children wouldn't see his shame. He never fired a gun in that war. He never wore a uniform. But more enemy aircraft fell to his machines than to almost any other American fighter. And today his name is known to almost no one. His name was Kelly Johnson. Before we dive in, subscribe and tell me in one sentence where in the world you're watching from. I read every single comment. To understand the man who built that airplane, you have to go back to a frozen mining town in the far north of Michigan, to a house with too many children and not enough of anything else. Clarence Johnson was born there in 1910, one of a large family of Swedish immigrants who had come to America chasing something better and found iron, snow, and hard winters instead. His mother took in other people's laundry, and little Clarence would load the clean wash onto a sled and pull it through town. But on the days the streets were crowded, he took the back alleys instead, because he could not bear for the other kids to see that this was what his family did to survive. Sit with that image for a second. A small boy, dragging other people's clothes through the snow, hiding in the back streets of his own hometown. And somewhere in that cold, ashamed little heart, he made a promise to himself that he wrote down and kept for the rest of his life, that one day he would come back to that town, not on the back streets, but on the best streets. Have you ever felt that? That small, fierce, private vow you make when you're young and you have nothing, that you will not stay where the world has put you? Most people make that promise, and life slowly wears it away. Kelly Johnson made it dragging a sled through the snow, and he spent the next 70 years proving it true. That is where this story begins. Not with an airplane, with a boy who decided that shame would not be the end of him. They called him Clara because his name was Clarence, and children are cruel in the specific way that leaves marks for life. He took it and took it, until one morning he decided he was done taking it, and the boy who mocked him went home with a broken leg. After that, nobody called him Clara again. They called him Kelly, and the name stuck to him like armor for the next 80 years. He was 13 when he won his first prize for designing an aircraft. 13. While other boys were dreaming about being pilots, Kelly Johnson was already dreaming about the thing underneath the pilot, the wing, the line, the shape of the air itself. He clawed his way through school on almost no money, and in 1933, he walked into the Lockheed Aircraft Company and took a job as a tool designer for $83 a month. He was nobody. He was the lowest man in the building, and within days of arriving, this nobody walked into the office of the chief engineer and told him to his face that the company's newest airplane was dangerously unstable and would get people killed. Imagine the nerve. Imagine being 23, broke, brand new, and telling the most important engineer in the building that he was wrong. They tested it, and the kid was right. That was the moment Lockheed understood what had just walked through their door. A few years later, they would lock him alone in a London hotel room with 72 hours to redesign an entire aircraft for a British nation staring down the coming war. And he did it in 3 days, because that was simply who he was. When the world needed something impossible, fast, it learned to hand the problem to the quiet man with the Swedish name and get out of his way. 4 years later, the United States Army came to Lockheed with a demand that bordered on the impossible. They wanted a fighter that could climb higher, faster, and farther than anything alive. Numbers so steep that most engineers in America quietly believed no single engine airplane could ever reach them. And Kelly Johnson looked at those numbers and understood something the others didn't. If one engine couldn't do it, you used two. He sat down and sketched every shape two engines could make on an airplane, one after another, dozens of them, until he arrived at something that looked like nothing else in the sky. A fighter with the pilot in a small pod in the middle, and two long booms stretching back behind the engines, ending in twin tails. It was radical. It was ungainly. People didn't know whether to laugh at it or be afraid of it, but buried inside that strange silhouette was a promise no other fighter could make. It could fly farther than anything else in the American arsenal, and that shape, the one the world would come to know at a glance, was not born from a dream of beauty. It was born from a problem, wrestled into being by a man who simply refused to accept that the numbers couldn't be met. Remember that. Hold on to that word, range, because years from now, on a morning over the Pacific, that single quality is going to decide the fate of the entire war in the sky. And then, almost the moment it was born, it nearly died on a golf course. In February of 1939, the Army wanted to prove what this machine could do, so they sent the prototype streaking across the entire United States, coast to coast, trying to set a record. Picture it, this brand new secret weapon, the only one in existence, tearing across a continent while the whole country held its breath and read the headlines. It very nearly made it. But on the final approach into New York, gliding down behind a line of slower training planes, ice formed silently in the engines, and both of them quietly refused to answer. There was no warning. One moment, the most advanced fighter in America was floating down toward the runway, and the next it was a glider with no power and nowhere to go. The only one of its kind on the entire planet came down short of the runway and tore itself apart across a golf course, through a tree, one wing ripped clean away. The pilot walked out of the wreck alive, but Kelly Johnson's airplane, the thing he had poured himself into, lay shattered in the grass while the whole country watched. And here is the strange, beautiful truth of that day. It didn't matter. The machine had flown fast enough, far enough, in those few hours before the crash, that the Army ordered it anyway. Sometimes the thing you build survives not because it was perfect, but because for one brief moment it showed everyone what it could become. But the airplane had a secret, and the secret was killing people. When pilots pushed it into a steep dive, something happened that no one on Earth understood yet. The controls would go stone dead in their hands. The nose would tuck down, harder and harder, and no amount of strength could pull it back. The airplane simply would not answer. Kelly Johnson had been one of the very first people alive to even suspect what was happening. He was staring into a wall no aircraft had ever hit before, the edge of the speed of sound itself, and he did not yet have the tools to see it clearly. He gave his test pilots a device meant to help them haul the nose back up, and on a November day in 1941, a test pilot named Ralph Virden took the airplane up to find that invisible wall, and when he hit it, the fix Kelly had given him worked too well. The forces tore the tail from the airplane. Virden came down in a quiet Glendale neighborhood and did not survive. Think about what that does to a man like Kelly Johnson. He had drawn every line of that machine. He had handed that pilot the very device that failed him. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs only to the people who make things, the ones who lie awake asking whether a different choice, a different line on the page, would have brought a man home to his family. The people who create the things that carry us are haunted in a way the rest of us never see, because when it goes wrong, they know exactly whose hand drew the line. He went back to the board. He kept going, not because he was cold, but because somewhere out there were thousands of young men who were going to fly this thing into a war, and the only way to honor the one he had lost was to make sure the rest of them came home. And he did. Because by 1943, his strange twin-tailed machine had become something the enemy feared on two sides of the world. And now we come back to that morning over the ocean. American codebreakers had done something almost unbelievable. They had cracked the enemy's messages, and inside those messages was a schedule. The single most important man in the Japanese Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, the mind that had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, was going to be flying to a forward base at an exact time, on an exact route. He was more than 1,000 miles away, and every American commander who looked at that distance ran into the same brutal wall. No fighter had the legs to fly that far. Find him, fight, and come home. No wildcat, no corsair. Nothing the Navy or the Marines could put in the air could reach that far out and back. Nothing except the strange twin-boomed fighter that a poor boy from Michigan had built around one obsession: range. 16 of them lifted off, dropped down to the waves to stay hidden, and flew for 2 hours barely above the water, navigating by nothing but a compass and a clock, and the nerve of the men flying them. And at the exact minute the math said he would be there, he was there. The airplane Kelly Johnson built to fly farther than anything else brought down the man who started the war in the Pacific, who fired the final shots, became a bitter argument that lasted for decades. But the machine that made it possible was never in question. It could only have been the one built by the boy from the back alleys. And think for a moment of what that range meant to the ordinary boys, not the admirals, not the aces, just the frightened young men in bombers who now had a fighter that could stay beside them all the way to the target and all the way home. Every mile Kelly Johnson squeezed out of that airplane was a mile some mother's son didn't have to fly alone. He never met those boys. He never knew their names. But they came home because of a shape he drew on a board in California. And that is a kind of love that never gets a monument. And the men who loved that airplane became legends because of it. The two highest-scoring American fighter pilots of the entire war both flew it, both in the Pacific, both scoring victory after victory in the machine Kelly built. One of them, Dick Bong, would fall not to the enemy, but while testing a new jet in the last days of the war. The other, Tommy Maguire, died in his Lightning over the Philippines, throwing his airplane into a desperate low turn to save a fellow pilot's life, and giving his own instead. He was 24 years old. He rests today at Arlington, under a white stone like all the others, and most of the people who walk past it will never know that the young man beneath it once ruled the Pacific sky in a machine built by a boy from a frozen mining town. And here is a name you already know, one that ties this story to another: Charles Lindbergh, the most famous flyer who ever lived, forbidden from the war by his own government, came to the Pacific as a civilian and flew this fighter into combat beside those young men, and the one enemy plane he ever shot down, he shot down in a P-38, the same man, the same hands that flew the Corsair we spoke of before. These airplanes, these stories, they are all threads of the same cloth, and almost none of the people who wove them are remembered. But the airplane did not only take lives, it carried one of the gentlest souls of the century to his end. On a summer day in 1944, a French pilot lifted off from an island in the Mediterranean in a version of Kelly's Lightning, flew out over the sea, and simply vanished. His name was Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and before the war he had written a small book about a little prince from a distant star, a book that has since been read and wept over by more people than almost any other story ever told. For 60 years, no one knew what happened to him. Then a fisherman pulled a silver bracelet with his name on it from the sea, and divers found the broken pieces of his airplane resting deep on the Mediterranean floor. 60 years, an entire lifetime of not knowing, of a whole nation wondering where its gentlest voice had gone. And when they finally found him, there were no answers waiting on that seabed, only the quiet confirmation that the sky had taken him and kept its silence. Think of what this one machine held inside its history. On one morning, it carried vengeance across 1,000 miles of ocean. On another, it carried away the man who taught the world that what is essential is invisible to the eye. The same shape in the sky, the same wing, the same lines drawn by the same quiet hand in Burbank. An airplane is never just metal. It is every soul it ever carried and every soul it ever took. The man who built it never chose who it would carry or who it would claim. He only gave it wings and let the world decide the rest. Kelly Johnson lived a long life, and he never stopped. And before we leave the war behind, there is one small, joyful thing worth knowing. Somewhere in the middle of all that blood and fear, when the 5,000th Lightning rolled off the line in Burbank, the workers, the ordinary men and women who had built every one of them by hand, didn't want to send it off in dull olive drab like all the others. So they painted it a brilliant, screaming red, wrote a single word across it, and flew it low over the country for everyone to see. The word they chose was Yippee. Think about that. In the darkest years the world had ever known, the people building this machine loved it enough to paint it like a child's toy and shout for joy. That is what Kelly Johnson's airplane meant to the people closest to it. The boy who hid in the back alleys went on to draw the airplanes that defined the next half-century of flight. The first American jet fighter, the spy planes that flew to the edge of space, and finally the Blackbird, an airplane so far ahead of its time that on the day Kelly Johnson died, more than 30 years after he designed it, it was still the fastest machine any human being had ever flown. Let that settle over you. A child pulling laundry through the Michigan snow, so ashamed he took the back streets, grew up to build the fastest thing the human race has ever put into the sky. He kept the promise he made to that frozen town. He came back on the best streets, and then he flew right past them, all the way to the edge of the sky. And the next time you see that unmistakable shape at an air show, twin booms, twin tails, that low, unmistakable growl coming in over the trees, I want you to do something. I want you to look at it and not think about the war or the speed or the guns. I want you to think about a small boy in the snow who decided that shame would not be the end of his story, and who was right. A boy nobody believed in, from a town nobody remembers, who reached higher than almost anyone who ever lived. His name was Kelly Johnson. He built the fighter that ruled the Pacific, and the world forgot his name, but you won't, not anymore. And if you want to meet the other machine Lindbergh flew into that same ocean war, the Corsair, and the forgotten man who drew it before anyone had ever heard his name, that story is waiting for you on your screen right now.